The Second World War is one of the greatest tragedies in human history. Many historians would go even further and call it the greatest tragedy in world history. It is impossible to know the total number of lives the war cost, but some of the best estimates arrive at there being 50 million people killed during the course of the World War II. In addition, millions more were injured and permanently disabled, millions of women raped and the victims of sexual violence. Millions more experienced the destruction of their homes or their entire city or native village. Millions more lost property, possessions, a way of life, a sense of peace, or a feeling of stability as millions were forced into becoming refugees, often displaced from their entire country. The legacy of the Second World War is still with us today, and thus anyone who is to be informed on the contemporary world must understand the origins, development, and consequences of the greatest struggle in human history. There is some debate on how to exactly date World War II. The war began and ended at different times in different places. It began for China in 1931, it commenced in 1939 for Poland, and 1941 for the United States, and not until 1944 for some South American countries. Many historians have actually come to see the European wars of the 20th century as the same large, ongoing war, thus making it one world war from 1914, when Imperial Germany invaded Western Europe, until 1994, when the last Soviet troops departed Germany. For this lecture, I will work with the more traditional dates assigned to World War II, those being 1939 until 1945. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I finally came to an end. The Great War, as it was then known, had claimed a staggering 20 million lives, the greatest conflict in history. Europe was thrilled the war was over, and sickened by the carnage, they were determined to never let such a conflict occur again. It was only an armistice that was agreed upon and went into effect at 11 a.m. on November 11th in 1918. The many outstanding issues that had provoked the war had yet to be resolved. The victorious Allies decided to meet in Paris early the next year of 1919. The Paris Peace Conference was formed in an effort to resolve the disputes that still lingered after World War I was over and to prevent an additional war. The hopes of millions of Europeans rode on the success of the conference, and its architects were expected to deliver the peace that Europe so eagerly desired. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, received widespread acclaim even before the war was over as the person who might just be able to deliver the longed-for and enduring peace. Wilson was met by massive crowds when he arrived in Paris, and Europeans exhausted by the war believed his plan would be a great success. Wilson's plan for enduring peace was known as the 14 Points. Its 14 principles would resolve the issues stemming from World War I and put in place the provisions needed to prevent nations from once again going to war. Nations of the world would practice open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, freedom to trade, freedom from arms buildup, freedom from imperial domination, and freedom from the invaders that occupied their countries. Imperial Germany would evacuate conquered lands and see a reduction in its land holdings. The empires of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire would experience the same reductions. Poland would be free and independent. And a League of Nations would be created that provided mutual guarantees of peace and coexistence, an early form of the United Nations. President Wilson's 14 points were received coldly and suspiciously when he arrived in Paris and met with the other Allied leaders. David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando of Italy, and President Georges Clemenceau of France. These European leaders had only one item on their agendas: revenge. They had all suffered too great a loss of life in their nation to retain the same idealism Wilson had. The Allied heads of state wanted to see Germany punished, humiliated, and forced to pay for the total cost of the war and its destruction. In the end, as the peace conference progressed, the results were a mix of the two agendas. The Allied leaders tepidly agreed to Wilson's 14 points, but not enthusiastically. Wilson more or less went along with the other Allied demands for punishing Germany. In the minds of Germans, however, the Treaty of Versailles, which was concluded in 1919, was nothing but vindictive and full of malice. Germany was forced to pay the extraordinary sum of $31 billion, later increased to $33 billion. Germany and the defeated nations were restricted in the amount of arms they could construct. All German, Austrian, and Ottoman possessions were entitled to self-determination, or determining their own destinies. Perhaps most humiliating, Germany was forced to sign the Guilt Clause as part of the treaty, which said Germany was solely responsible for the Great War, which certainly was not true. In the mind of Wilson, he knew portions of the treaty were harsh, but he retained his optimism that the League of Nations would settle any additional disputes in the years to come. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, just outside of Paris. The Great War was finally over. Hopefully, now Europe would enjoy its long-awaited peace. The Treaty of Versailles fundamentally reshaped the map of Europe that stroked new jealousies, established new rivalries, and set the stage for the bitter conflicts to come.
The 2 decades between the First and Second World War are critical years in order to understand why the world went to war again at the end of these years. Europe particularly was struggling during these decades to understand and recover from the First World War, which concluded in 1918, and tragically another war broke out about 2 decades later. The Treaty of Versailles was negotiated by the victorious Allies in 1919, imposed some harsh terms and punishments on Germany, and in many ways set the table for the growing conflict in the years to come. By the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, all losing nations in World War I, were stripped of their colonies, had large tracts of land stripped away from them by the victors, saw the end of their historic monarchies, and felt a sense of collective humiliation after the treaty was imposed on them. Germany was forced to pay the astronomical and impossible sum of $33 billion to the Allies and sign off on the so-called Guilt Clause, in which the Germans had to acknowledge as being solely responsible for the war. The defeated nations felt humiliated after the war and blamed for the entirety of the First World War's destruction. Defeated and humiliated populations provided fertile ground for radical leaders and parties during the interwar years that tragically led to future conflict. It is difficult to overstate the destruction across particularly Western Europe at the conclusion of the First World War. Villages, towns, homes, entire small cities were leveled as a consequence of the large artillery guns used during the course of the First World War. Parts of the European landscape were scorched by fire, scarred by endless trenching, and leveled by the large-scale firefights. Ancient and medieval structures, priceless in the history of Western civilization, were lost to fire, bombardment, and destruction. The famous Cloth Hall in Ypres, France, originally constructed in the 13th century, was completely destroyed during the war along with the rest of the town. Wreckage from battle littered the French and Belgian countrysides, burned-out vehicles, undetonated ordnance, and human and animal corpses turning up all across farmers' fields. Such destruction in the First World War prompted many Europeans to think that never again would Europe go to war in the age of industrialism, because the consequences, destruction, and loss of life would always be too immense. The very landscape of much of Western Europe was altered due to the immense amount of artillery shelling, and even more so because of the large-scale explosives used as mines on the front. Whole sections of the earth were blasted into the sky with the men, animals, and materials that moments before occupied the same spot. Huge craters, now filled with water for farmers to water their crops, still mark the landscape in portions of western France, a grim but silent reminder of the large-scale destruction that characterized the First World War. After over 100 years, remnants of the trenches, of World War I still remain in isolated spots. They are a silent reminder of the destruction of the war and the immense suffering and death that Europeans experienced during the years 1914 to 1918. The war was so unprecedented and horrifying that most Europeans fatally believed the continent would never go to war again, as the consequences were too appalling. Europeans had to come to grips with the sheer numbers of those who perished in the First World War by consecrating large sections of land for memorials and cemeteries. The sheer size of some of these memorials or the extensive number of graves caused visitors to gasp at the tragic loss of life for each nation at each battlefield. Row after row of Christian crosses and stars of David bespoke how destructive and fatal modern industrialized warfare could be in the 20th century. Loved ones from foreign countries traveled to France and its newly dedicated cemeteries to find the grave of a loved one or a friend that had perished in the Great War. A new haunting innovation from these cemeteries was the construction of ossuaries, large structures often shaped similar to obelisks that contain the fragments of bodies unable to be identified after battle. Heads, torsos, arms, and legs filled the ossuaries, the only pieces remaining from lives blown to pieces by the guns of World War I. The numbers that perished during the war for each combatant nation were often staggering. Great Britain lost 900,000 citizens during the Great War. Belgium lost 130,000. Australia 61,000, and Canada 65,000. The United States lost 117,000. Italy lost 460,000. France lost close to 2 million of its people, and Russia close to 3 million. The defeated nations likewise suffered a catastrophic loss of life. The Ottoman Empire lost close to 3 million of its citizens for war-related reasons. The Austro-Hungarian Empire experienced 2 million deaths, and Imperial Germany lost somewhere between 2 and 3 million citizens due to battlefields deaths, wounds, sickness, malnutrition, or civilian casualties. The defeated nations also literally lost their nations, as Imperial Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire were broken up into reduced or smaller states, losing the national identities they had before the war. Veterans from World War I who served for one of the defeated nations often came home to a humiliated, impoverished country for which they had risked their lives. Particularly horrifying element of the First World War was the inability to identify some battlefield casualties as a result of industrialized warfare. For that reason, many nations constructed tombs of the unknown soldier after the war to honor a serviceman who had died in the war for their nation, but could not be positively identified. This is the tomb of the unknown soldier for an unknown German soldier. This is the tomb of the unknown soldier for Russia. A tomb of an unknown soldier was often constructed to honor a single unidentified battlefield casualty, but in reality, the single soldier and single tomb represented all soldiers who were unknown who nevertheless fought on behalf of their nation. This is the tomb of the unknown for Poland. The tomb of the unknown for a British soldier was placed inside Westminster Abbey in London. Canada's Tomb of the Unknown. The Tomb of the Unknown for France is located at the base of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The Tomb of the Unknown for Italy is placed alongside the Victor Emmanuel II monument in Rome. The Tomb of the Unknown in Australia. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, honoring an American soldier who served in World War I, is part of Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Besides the cemeteries, ossuaries, and tombs of unknown soldiers, Europeans found new ways to honor and remember the dead after the Great War. A red poppy became the common symbol of remembrance after the war, based on John McCrae's poem, In Flanders Fields. The poem reads, "In Flanders fields the poppies grow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. World War I also had a profound effect on the worldview and theological outlook of Europeans. Throughout the 19th century and before the war, Europeans held a very optimistic view of the world. There was an entrenched belief that man was basically good and that society, through industrialization and modernization, was gradually improving and getting better all the time. There was an assumption that man had moved beyond war and would never regress into killing each other on such a large scale again. The First World War shattered this optimism and prevailing belief in the dignity and goodness of man. Swiss theologian Karl Barth reflected this new attitude towards the nature of man. In his commentary on the biblical book of Romans, Barth highlighted the Bible's assertion of original sin and man's innate and prevailing depravity, sinners in need of a grace and a Savior. Whereas previous commentaries saw a basic goodness in man, Barth saw only sin and depravity. His contrary opinion led to German theologian Karl Adam to call Barth's commentary on Romans, quote, like a bombshell on the theologian's playground, unquote. Barth's negative view of mankind would match the cynicism of the interwar years, but also strangely coincide with a renewed belief that man would never go to war again, as the lesson of the Great War was that war was too destructive and there were really no winners. 3 new countries came into existence after World War I. Finally, after a multi-generational struggle to achieve independence, an Irish Free State was granted independence from Great Britain in 1921. Many Irish did not support Britain during the Great War, and realizing that calls for independence could no longer be ignored, an independent Ireland was created after a war for independence. The 6 counties in the northern part of the island, however, were not granted independence to join with the new Republic of Ireland. Rather, these colonies formed Northern Ireland and remained part of the United Kingdom. Many of these residents were descendants of British colonists and were predominantly Protestant and preferred to remain part of the United Kingdom as Unionists. The division between Northern Ireland as remaining part of Britain and the Republic of Ireland would provoke a long and bitter struggle between Unionists and Republicans for much of the 20th century. The Irish Republican Army, or IRA, was formed as the paramilitary wing of the Republicans who sought to form a united, free, and independent Ireland. This struggle between Unionists and Republicans would continue, often violently, until the 1990s. The nation of Turkey was also formed after World War I upon the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. Turkey declared its independence and abolition of the Ottoman Sultanate largely through the leadership of the Turkish soldier Mustafa Kemal. Mustafa Kemal offered a new nationalistic vision for Turkey, with a popularly elected government and a secular state that modernized Turkey and made the nation a significant player during the 20th century. Poland also reemerged as a significant Eastern European nation after the First World War. Poland had ceased to be a nation after it was partitioned in the 18th century by Prussia, Austria, and Russia. Throughout the 19th century, Poles longed for the independence of their nation as a free and independent state. That dream was achieved as part of the Treaty of Versailles. Poland came back into existence in 1919 and immediately fought a war to secure its territory with the neighboring Soviet Union. Tragically, just as Poland was solidifying its independence during the interwar years, it would be one of the first nations to be overrun and occupied during the Second World War and remain occupied throughout the war. Many Europeans, and particularly the American President Woodrow Wilson, firmly believed that war could be abolished and differences among nations could be resolved with the creation of an international body that could negotiate differences among nations and prevent future wars. The organization that was created after World War I to promote peace and harmony among nations was the League of Nations. The assumption was that member states would come together as part of the League and resolve their differences diplomatically, rather than on the battlefield. The formation of the League of Nations was conducted with an abundance of optimism. Many nations of the world joined the League, but notably the United States did not become a member. Although the American President Woodrow Wilson had done so much to advance the cause of the League, many members of Congress feared connecting the United States to a larger international body and feared that membership in the League would draw American troops into one war after another on foreign shores. Partly because of the absence of the Americans, the League of Nations was rather weak as an international peacekeeping body and failed to prevent the world from going to war in the next few years. Post-war optimism was evident as well during the Locarno treaties negotiated in the early 1920s in Locarno, Switzerland. The treaties established post-war boundaries and made some gains in welcoming back into the family of nations, particularly the defeated Germans. Germany even agreed to join the League of Nations. There was almost a tacit acknowledgement in the so-called spirit of Locarno that perhaps the victors had been too harsh with the defeated Germany, and a spirit of reconciliation prevailed. The aversion to another world war and a belief in an enduring peace was also evident in the 1920s with two important conferences. The Washington Naval Conference was a large disarmament conference that sought to reduce the size of the world's biggest navies, setting the naval tonnage ratios for Great Britain, the United States, and Japan. The ratio for naval tonnage for Great Britain and the United States was set at 5 and 5, but the ratio for Imperial Japan was set at 3. Japan naturally felt embittered by the slight and subsequently withdrew entirely from the agreement, enabling them to launch a massive naval construction program. Even more optimistically, the Kellogg-Briand Pact was an agreement between the United States and France to never use war as an agent of resolution in the event of a dispute between nations. In the shadow of the Second World War, it is hard not to look back upon these two conferences as overly optimistic and extremely idealistic to avoid the gathering storm that would soon convulse Europe and the world. The map of Europe was significantly altered after the First World War. The new nations of Ireland, Turkey, and Poland were created. The empires of Germany, Austria, and the Ottomans were broken up. New nations were formed out of the old empires, including Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia. Many of these nations were formed in committee and conference rooms and did not reflect accurately the dreams and wishes of its constituent populations, thus leading to new rivalries and additional sources of bitterness. It was clear very early during the interwar years that many of the disputes and animosities that led to the First World War were not yet resolved, even after the expense of 20 million lives. The First World War unquestionably had a profound effect on the worldview and attitudes of Europeans during the interwar years. Although there was horror and depression over the long casualty list stemming from the war, there was also a very free spirit in the next decade after the war. Some Europeans felt a sense of fatalism and inevitability about death, and therefore were determined to live life to the fullest if it was going to be short and full of death and suffering. That optimistic spirit was evidenced in the carefree attitude of many in the 1920s, known as the Golden Twenties, in Berlin. Berlin, in fact, becomes a new center of cultural expression in Europe in the 1920s. Germany and its capital had not been invaded, conquered, or destroyed during the course of World War I, and therefore did not need to be rebuilt. Reflecting the despair and fatalism that the war engendered, Berlin became a center of nightlife, parties, and indulgent lifestyles. Risque theater and cabaret shows proliferated during the 1920s. Laws against drugs and prostitution were few, lax, and poorly enforced. Homosexuality was openly embraced and rarely condemned. Art of the time period in Berlin was overtly sexual and indulgent, and reflected an indulgence mentality after the deprivations and horrors of World War I. Much of the art and culture of Weimar Berlin would draw the animus of the Nazis in the following decade as evidence of Jewish corruptions of the pure German race. Likewise in France, the 1920s were sometimes called Années Folles. the foolish or silly years. Paris, too, exhibited a fatalism about life and therefore a party atmosphere exhibited in the meantime. The Roaring Twenties became the moniker for the decade in the United States. What was roaring? Cities, nightlife, illegal bars known as speakeasies, cars, planes, and of course the music. The music genre that captured many urban Americans in the 1920s and then spread to Europe was jazz. Jazz was known for its syncopated beats and spontaneous improvisations, was an African-American music genre that emerged in the black quarters of Kansas City, New Orleans, Chicago, and Harlem, New York. Initially spurned by white audiences, jazz became the soundtrack of the 20s and the indulgent, carefree lifestyles of the interwar years. A carefree modernization was also reflected in the styles and outlook of women during the interwar years. European and American women began to speak of a new woman who departed from their Victorian mothers in priorities, lifestyle choices, and behaviors. The new woman of the 1920s wore less fabric of clothing, with higher hemlines and lower necklines. New women may wear more exotic or sensual clothing, show off their legs or ankles, bob their hair, and wear more makeup. Many new women smoked cigarettes or drank in public, danced to jazz, visited illegal bars, and rode in cars with boys unchaperoned by parents. Dating replaced courting in the 1920s. Some new women, often called flappers in the United States, were willing to delay marriage and childbirth and engage in premarital sex. In many European countries, women gained the right to vote during or right after World War I, and the styles and behaviors of the new woman represented a break with the more conventional and traditional past that was celebrated by some and looked upon with great concern by others. Significant inroads were made in science and technology during the interwar years. The Scottish scientist Alexander Fleming made one of the most significant discoveries in medicine when he discovered penicillin. Fleming actually stumbled upon the discovery when he left some petri dishes exposed and a window open in his laboratory. He discovered the next day that the bacteria in the dishes had been exposed to fungus in the air, and the fungus was killing the bacteria. Fleming's ability to isolate and develop penicillin led to the introduction of antisepsis and antibiotics. The discovery saved countless lives during the 20th century, and widespread antibiotics would be essential to the battlefields of the Second World War. The Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi made significant inroads at the end of the 19th century with wireless communication, and by the 1920s perfected a system that would become known as the radio. Marconi's invention would have significant impact on communications, everyday life, as well as battlefield communication during the Second World War. New ideas and cultural norms were broadcasted through the radio and signaled the development of modern entertainment and communication. The British Broadcasting Corporation, founded in 1922, would become one of the earliest and largest state-owned and operated media outlets for the broadcasting of news and culture. The growth of radios in common homes also enabled governments and politicians to employ a new level of propaganda to win over disaffected populations to their ideologies. It was two French brothers, Auguste and Louis Lumière, who first developed a useful movie camera at the end of the 19th century. Film was primitive in its early years and lacked the integration with sound. Audiences were nevertheless thrilled to watch a projected image move for the first time on a screen in very early movie theaters. The first film that the Lumière brothers ever produced was a short and silly clip known as The Waterer Watered. It wasn't much, but it did signal the age of film and entertainment that would become so important during the 20th century. Rough and poorly recorded silent films of World War I were created, but many more films would capture the seminal events of the Second World War. Although Southern California became the epicenter of American filmmaking in the 1920s, European cinema, sometimes referred to as the other Hollywood, also enjoyed great success in the 1920s. German movie stars Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich became known for their bold on-screen sensuality and exhibitionism. The African-American female Josephine Baker became a widespread star of stage and screen, particularly in Paris during the interwar years. eventually to be buried as a national French hero in the Pantheon. Charlie Chaplin delighted early audiences with slapstick humor and short plots that made early film engaging and exciting. The anxiety, fatalism, and morbid moods of the interwar years were also reflected in the art of the period. Forsaking the optimism, beauty, and idealism of the Romantic and Impressionistic periods, interwar artists endeavored to reflect the despair and reality of modern life and perspectives stemming particularly from the war. A new school, often known as New Objectivity, endeavored to show the banality, ugliness, and raw reality of everyday life rather than forsaken versions of beauty, idealism, or optimism. Otto Dix, the German painter and artist, was at the forefront of New Objectivity. His painting here, entitled Portrait of the Journalist Sylvia von Harden, is a radical departure from previous artistic notions of beauty, particularly of feminine beauty. The subject of this painting is not an idealized version of the female form, but rather an aged, cropped hair chain smoker. This type of subject matter would never have appeared in early schools of Romanticism or Impressionism. Otto Dix is more famous for his works that endeavored to capture the bleak realities of World War I battlefields. He often used dark and despairing colors, or an absence of color. Black, whites, grays reflect the grim realities of 20th century warfare. This etching, entitled Stormtroopers Advancing Under Gas, leaves the viewer without any sense of the humanity and personality of the soldiers and sees what modern warfare has done to them. They have become impersonal, non-entities lost in the harshness of modern battle. There is nothing beautiful, attractive, or appealing about their world. Another famous work by Dix is entitled The War. This four-paneled work resembles an altarpiece at the front of a church. This is appropriate as Dix is making the point that war has become the modern object of worship, and its worshippers should be confronted with the horrors of the object of their affections. This piece again lacks much color and is lost in the dismal shades of browns, grays, and pale whites. Soldiers are seen on the left marching off to battle. In the center, they have become almost one with the battlefield of destruction, sleeping or dying or blending into the trench and earth. They are depicted as dying on the right and consigned to a grave-like experience as they sleep in the trench. Again, the subjects lack personality and identity. The experience of war has consumed them and devoured them with purposelessness. These themes are also evident in Dix's work, Flanders. Once again, the impersonality of war is reflected in the sleeping or dead soldier melting into the scorched landscape along with other dying and dead soldiers. Bland, brown, and gray colors predominate again. Besides capturing the horrors of the First World War, interwar artists also endeavored to critique its senselessness and superficiality. Dadaism was a new school that celebrated or drew attention to the purposelessness and materialism of modern life. Along with surrealism, Dadaism is sometimes called anti-art, a rejection of the art that went before with its emphasis on beauty, precision, idealism, and meaning. Dadaist artist Tristan Tzara was quoted as saying, "The acts of life have no beginning or end. Everything happens in a completely idiotic way. Like everything in life, Dada is useless." Dadaists earned their name from the blabbing of a child, endeavoring to declare that all of life is meaningless, baby bladder, such as da 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 da, hence the name Dadaism. A fine example of Dadaism is found in Hannah Hoch's mosaic entitled Cut with the Kitchen Knife Through the First Epoch of the Weimar Beer Belly Culture. This work is a composite of random newspaper cuttings that expose the meaninglessness and decadence of modern life. Materialism, advertising, entertainment, and superficial junk are showcased here to highlight the busy uselessness of modern life and consumerism. The mosaic endeavored to be an expose of Weimar Germany's obsession with pleasure, decadence, and self-absorption. A third example of art during the interwar years that expressed the despair and purposelessness of modern life was surrealism. Surrealism was heavily influenced by the emergence of Freudian psychology and its interest in the subconscious life of the mind. Surrealism endeavored to paint topics beyond man's immediate conscious and sensible reality. Urges, desires, dreams, inclinations, feelings, insecurities, fears, and other emotions were popular topics for Surrealist artists. Surrealist works did not always make immediate sense, but that was the point. Capturing the inner and buried life of man required randomness, purposelessness, and disorder. The Spanish artist Salvador Dali was at the forefront of the Surrealist movement. Dali joined the emerging anti-art and Surrealist movement emerging in Spain in the 1920s and eventually became its foremost practitioner. Dali was interested in themes of modernity, religion, sexuality, and technology. He often employed elongated figures, vibrant colors, and strange and random objects placed together to invite his viewers into the buried subconscious of the human mind, as he does here in his 1945 work, The Temptation of St. Anthony. This is Rhapsody Moderne, painted in 1957, and a good example of Dali's interest in the relationship between humans and technology and the depersonalization that can often occur when the two are associated. The Persistence of Memory, painted in 1931, was Dali's first notable work that made him a well-known international artist. His attempt to paint memory with sagging clocks is a good example of the challenge and enticement of painting the inner life of man. Geopoliticus Child Watching the Birth of the New Man, painted in 1943, shows Dali's awareness of the tremendous world-shaping events that were occurring during the Second World War, and that something of a new world order would emerge from the destruction of the old. Fascination with the subconscious also carried over into interwar literature. Virginia Woolf was a British author who endeavored to capture the inner workings of the mind, hidden insecurities, fears, anxieties, and depressions. She experimented with stream of conscious writing and moving the flow of a narrative away from a sequence of events and towards the randomness of human thought in various contexts. The Irish author James Joyce also experimented with these themes in his works. Pushing the boundaries of what was considered appropriate, Joyce often inflamed censors. Joyce's literature was part of a larger avant-garde modernist trend that also experimented with stream of conscious writing and the buried life of the human experience. In the field of psychology, Freudian interest in the subconscious continued to inform a multitude of theorists and therapists. Where Freud was primarily interested in an individual's subconscious, Carl Jung researched and studied the subconscious of groups in group psychology. Some of his works were particularly timely as fascist and totalitarian dictators employed new means of mass propaganda to influence the collective psychologies of entire nations. Whereas the 1920s are remembered as a decade of indulgence, pleasure, consumerism, and superficiality, the 1930s unmistakably represented a departure from those carefree concerns and would be remembered primarily as a decade of deprivation, hunger, poverty, and desperation. The 1930s were defined by the Great Economic Depression that commenced in the 1920s and then expanded into a worldwide economic slowdown in the 1930s. Various nations of the world concocted various responses to the economic crisis, and understanding their responses is a key to seeing the increase in odds for world conflict by the end of the decade. Put simply, the Great Depression was a significant cause of the Second World War. The Great Depression commenced at different times in different regions of the world, and its severity and duration varied as well across the globe. Germany plunged immediately into economic collapse after World War I. Italy likewise suffered a depression in the 1920s. The United States entered the Great Depression in 1929. The UK and France had more or less emerged from the crisis by the late 1930s, but the Depression stubbornly held on in the United States well into the late 1930s. Although certainly not the singular or exclusive cause of the Depression, the collapse of the American stock market in late 1929 was a significant shove against the U.S. and world economy to fall into economic depression. The New York Stock Exchange had enjoyed rapid growth and investment throughout the 1920s, with many average Americans choosing to purchase stocks and bonds in get-rich-quick schemes. The entire value of the market tripled between 1925 and 1929, from $27 billion to $87 billion. Blue-chip stocks such as AT&T rose from $209 to $303, and General Motors rose from $260 per share to $452 per share. The ceiling for profit seemed to be endless. However, much of these stock purchases, $7 billion worth, were bought on margin, that is, on credit. Expansion of the market continued into September and October of 1929, but then as investors became spooked that the market was overvalued and overextended, a wave of selling occurred in late October, climaxing with 16 million shares being sold on Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. Rapid selling continued into November, and by mid-November, the market had shed over $30 billion of paper profits. Investors were crushed by the losses, and many who woke up rich one morning were destitute and bankrupt by the end of the same day. Cars, boats, and houses were repossessed by banks. Payments couldn't be made on fine jewelry or on new household appliances. Farm mortgages were called in by banks, leaving many rural workers homeless. Stunningly, the mighty U.S. economy that had been so robust during World War I and in the 1920s suddenly collapsed with spiraling unemployment and bankruptcies. The stock market crash was not the first of its kind, but it was the first of its degree. It was not the cause of the Great Depression, perhaps the last major cause, driving the U.S. and world economies into recession and depression. Many Americans did not own stocks or bonds and thus had nothing to lose with the Great Crash, but the domino effect of the stock market crash led to many other negative economic realities that did impact a multitude of Americans. It would be over 10 years until the United States economy was able to recover from the Great Depression. It was not really until World War II that brought the economy back from the brink. There were a multitude of causes for the Great Depression in the 1930s, but several major trends can be identified as key factors as to why European economies collapsed in the 1920s and 1930s. Many Western economies had become consumer economies in the 1920s, and when, for a variety of reasons, many consumers stopped purchasing as much as provoked a slowdown in many industries. Many Western economies had become consumer economies in the 1920s, and when, for a variety of reasons, many consumers stopped purchasing as much, it provoked a slowdown in many industries. Several Western nations also practiced a very tight monetary policy when the first signs of trouble broke out, which did not provide their economies with the cash to lubricate economic growth. The war reparations imposed on the defeated nations, particularly Germany, were so harsh that their economies were driven into collapse, which boomeranged against the victorious powers and their economies after the war. High tariffs imposed, particularly in the United States, strangled free trade and prohibited the free and easy exchange of goods. Household and personal debt reached some all-time highs due to extensive purchasing in the 1920s. American farmers fell into economic recession by 1926 due to an abundance of crops that remained unpurchased even as farm prices were collapsing. Finally, installment buying, getting goods before they were paid for, also became an inducement for economic slowdown. The economy of the United Kingdom had been increasingly tied to the U.S. economy in recent decades, so it is not surprising that when the U.S. economy collapsed in 1929, Great Britain went along with it. The UK had been immensely dependent on the U.S. during the war for arms and war materials, and had not really been able to pay back on large portions of the debt owed to the United States. The Great Depression led to high rates of unemployment, reduced purchasing power, and little access to investment credit in the early 1930s in the UK. Long lines outside of soup kitchens and even large crowds on hunger strikes became all too common scenes in London and other major British cities. Interestingly, it was the British economist John Maynard Keynes who to a degree had predicted the coming of the Great Depression and worried about the solutions to which Europe would turn amidst economic downturn. He had done so in his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which called on the Allied nations not to impose a Carthaginian or harsh peace on Germany, as it could have disastrous consequences on the future. Keynes also wrote the key book that inspired the response of many Western nations to the Great Depression. In 1936, he published The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, in which he called on nations to practice pump priming, that is, deficit spending, to generate growth in Western economies. He declared Western economies needed to generate growth by spending money on public works projects and additional domestic investments, even if the national government did not have the money in its budgets. Keynesian economics became the primary approach Western democracies took to overcome the Depression in their nations and led to a record-breaking level of government intervention in national life. The Great Depression was particularly biting in the United Kingdom as a result of the Great War. Britain lost many of its markets to the United States and Japan during the war and never really recovered. Coal, steel, and textile industries declined during the war, spiking unemployment. Unemployment numbers for 1921 were 2 million Britons. In 1929, it was 1 million. In 1932, 3 million were unemployed, and in 1936, 1.6 million Britons were unemployed. The severity of the Depression provoked the rise of the Labour Party in Britain, with politics that leaned in a more socialist or at least strongly Keynesian direction. Ramsay MacDonald became the first Labour Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 1924. A coalition government composed of Conservatives and Labour Party members came together during the Depression to guide the nation through the crisis and set up the primary political rivalry between Conservatives and Labour that still exists today in British politics. Whereas the British economy collapsed as much as 5% in the early 1930s, the British economy was able to gradually recover and experience growth in the latter part of the decade. The Great Depression also provoked strong divisions and reactions in France and led to a realignment and formation of new parties in the French Republic. There was strong appeal in France in the 1930s for fascist-type political parties. These parties promised economic growth accompanied by strong government intervention and controls. They looked eerily similar to the fascists that took over Italy and Germany during the 1930s. Perhaps France could have gone the way of fascist Italy or Nazi Germany during the 1930s, except for the fact that the French fascist parties were very divided and were never able to unify or coalesce around a single leader. Instead, France turned towards more leftist economic policies, absent of the strong repressions of fascism, by turning to socialists, communists, and even radical groups that are able to unify into the singular Popular Front Party. The Popular Front was distinctly leftist, but compared to the fascist offerings, it seemed the party of liberty in traditional Republican France. The Popular Front was able to win national elections and dominate the National Assembly during the 1930s, and managed to hold at bay the appeal of stronger fascist groups. Raymond Poincaré, who led France's government during the 1920s, sought to restore French economic power through the expectation that Germany would pay all of its war reparations in the next few years. Poincaré's efforts met with mixed results and numerous riots in France during the 1930s, revealing the deep concerns the population had amidst the Great Depression. Léon Blum served as the head of the Popular Front government as prime minister in the 1930s, successfully steering French politics away from involvement in the Spanish Civil War and also away from the leanings of the rival fascist political parties. Social democratic parties dominated Scandinavian states during the Great Depression. Private businesses worked together in cooperatives as a mix of capitalism and socialism. 90% of the Danish milk industry was organized into cooperatives. Socialist governments enacted high taxes and provided old age pensions, subsidized housing, paid vacations, maternity allowances, and unemployment insurance starting in the 1930s. Many economists judge Scandinavia as one of the more successful regions in dealing with the Depression. The Great Depression was a particularly grueling experience in the United States. The U.S. had experienced unprecedented growth and economic expansion during the First World War in the 1920s, and thus had a greater height from which to fall. The Depression started a little later in the U.S. than in Europe and lasted longer and later than many sections of Europe. Historians still debate the causes and effective remedies for the Depression in the U.S. today, but it was really American entry into World War II that finally pulled the United States out of the depths of the Great Depression. Black Tuesday, or the collapse of the American stock market in October 1929, had a cascading effect on the economy, affecting millions of Americans in unprecedented ways. Strict monetary policy, contracted credit, and the overextension of lending and investment by banks led to many banks failing to hold the deposits for the Americans who placed their savings in a given institution. Ugly scenes occurred across the country as Americans ran to their local banks seeking to withdraw their savings, only to be told the bank did not have their deposits or that the bank had closed. Millions of Americans lost millions of deposits, which further plunged the nation into depression. The Depression in the United States was made worse by the outbreak of a major ecological disaster in the American Midwest. Years of reckless farming practices as well as sustained drought caused massive dust storms that collectively became known as the Dust Bowl. All across the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and the Texas Panhandle, particularly, huge swaths of American farmland were picked up by the wind and blown away. Cropland was stripped, houses and cars buried, livestock perished, and farming came to a standstill. The misery of the Dust Bowl only heightened the misery of the Great Depression even further. 1932 was the most severe year for the Great Depression in the United States. Unemployment hit an unprecedented 25%, a previously thought to be impossible mark. Sluggishly, unemployment dogged the American economy throughout the 1930s and was not fully reduced until American entry into World War II in 1941. Elected in a landslide in 1932, the governor of New York, Franklin Roosevelt, came to the presidency determined to use the power of government to soften the effects of the Depression and put Americans back to work. Roosevelt's plan to recover the American economy and rebuild it became known as the New Deal. In the end, the New Deal was a distinctly Keynesian approach to political economy, relying on a firm belief in the power of government to spend more money to generate growth and employment. As the first American president to be elected to 4 terms, Franklin Roosevelt had an unprecedented number of years to implement his programs. The New Deal was based on a multitude of government programs that would regulate the economy, put Americans to work for the government, and endeavor to prevent another Great Depression from ever happening again in the nation. Often nicknamed the alphabet soup due to the abbreviations of the programs, the New Deal met with some successes, some failures, and an abundance of national debate. Here are some of the examples of New Deal programs. The AAA, or Agricultural Adjustment Administration, endeavored to stabilize farm prices and improve farming techniques to rescue farmers from the worst effects of the Dust Bowl. The CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps, was designed to build national parks and plant trees to put young American men to work in America's rural areas. FDIC, or Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, was designed to provide government insurance for bank deposits and reduce the danger and fear of bank runs. The PWA, Public Works Administration, and WPA, Works Progress Administration, constructed small and large construction projects at the expense of the government, including roads, squares, dams, and public buildings. The TVA, or Tennessee Valley Authority, constructed dams to harness hydroelectric power in Appalachia. The Wagner Act protected the rights of unions to collectively bargain, and Social Security provided pensions for senior citizens. Historians would continue to debate the effectiveness of the New Deal, but for many contemporary Americans, knowing that the president and the government was doing much to improve their lives during the Depression was powerful reassurance and impetus to believe in the New Deal. The Great Depression did not affect all nations equally. Many colonized nations, or Third World nations, were already in the grip of poverty and thus experienced nothing new during the Depression. As their mother countries were locked into depression, however, many colonial states endeavored to organize for self-rule and took advantage of the crisis to advocate for their own national independence.